Welcome back, Petapixel viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and look what I have got my hands on, a true rarity. This is the first brand new film camera in production that I've ever personally reviewed. It is a Pentax 17. We're gonna play with it in downtown streets of Portland. So of course the analog market, it really has made a resurgence, but it's largely fueled by the used camera market. So we're trying to think, like, when was the last time we saw a newish camera? The Nikon F6, I mean, that's 20 years ago. The Nikon FM10, I mean, those cameras are great, but they're long since discontinued. So I think it's actually a really bold move by Ricoh Pentax to not re-release an old camera, but actually make a totally brand new camera for the analog market. And this is it, the Pentax 17. So interesting thing about the Pentax 17, it has a striking design. It's actually designed by Suzuki Takeo, who's more commonly known by his pen name TKO. He designed this camera, and he actually found a lot of inspiration from older Pentax cameras. Now, first thing first, I gotta load film into the Pentax 17, and interesting enough, the film rewind lever is modeled off of the Pentax LX, a famous manual camera of theirs, and then this is an actual analog manual thumb wind mechanism, and this is inspired by the Auto 110. So why the Pentax 17 name? Well, that's because we're shooting half-frame film, 17 millimeters wide. The lens though on this is a 25 millimeter f3.5, and in full frame equivalent terms, that's not a 35, thankfully it's a 37, so I'm happy to use this lens today. Okay, now let's talk about the shutter in here. It's a mechanical leaf shutter, but it does have a fairly limited operating range here, unfortunately. So we're going from 4 seconds maximum timed exposure up to 3/50th of a second. That's not that fast. It doesn't cut that much light. And so on a day like today, bright day, I'm shooting 400 ISO film right now, so I could shoot in the shade or outside in the bright day. I know the aperture is going to its maximum tightness of f16 a lot of the time. So of course we have to stop because we see not one but two Canadian flags. I believe right now it's Fleet Week, so we're actually seeing a lot of military and naval ships around, but there you go. I just wish the wind would blow and make them look more proud and, you know,
Take
strong.
a picture anyway.
I did already. Oh, it's gonna be horizontal.
Woo.
Nice short throw on that thumb winder. It's light, it's easy, but very quick. I mean, it's only moving half a frame, so that makes sense. No weather seals. Okay, so one thing that's throwing me off a little bit is this off-on switch. Now, first off, it's really nicely implemented. Big blade on there, very easy to manipulate, not a problem there. What I'm finding though is because I'm so digitally oriented most of the time, I'm habitually turning it off to save battery life. But what I am then finding is I go to take a picture, press the shutter, obviously, oh yeah, gotta turn the camera on before I can get a shot. Now, battery life on this is really good because it's using a lithium CR2 disposable battery, and you can of course buy those pretty much at any convenience store if you need more power. But also this has a clever power off function. It's about a minute, it'll power down. And so really one thing I'll get used to is just leave this camera on all the time. Don't turn it off until I'm sure that I'm done shooting. So on the side of the camera here, we got actually a really substantial but very comfortable grip, and this is where it's housing the CR2 battery just under a screw cap there. And then I love the thumb winder. I'm really missing this. I mean, I forget how much I miss it on cameras. I can fidget with it, I can play with it, I can tuck my thumb behind it, just give me a good secure feeling on the camera. Love everything about it. As far as the construction goes, we actually do have magnesium top and bottom plates. This is metal, but it is very lightweight. I mean, we're under 300 grams, around 290, less than a sixth of a knock. So I almost do want a bit more weight in there just to give it that solid feel, a little bit more weight for hand holding, but it's very easy to carry around all day. Now we do have a little fixed flash here. It's actually visually designed off of the Pentax KP's flash. This is a full TTL flash. It does lock the shutter speed at 1/25th of a second. As a leaf shutter, I'm sure it could sync to other speeds, but 1/25th is a good compromise between letting in some ambient light, but still being fast enough to prevent any motion blur. But that's it for flash. I mean, there's no way to change the directionality. I suppose I could diffuse it with a bit of tissue paper or something, and there's no option for an external flash to use with that. So one of the most fun things about the Pentax 17, and what would set it apart from a lot of the half-frame point and shoots on the market, is this is very much a sort of vintage, tactile experience, and that does make it a lot of fun. Let's start here on the left. So I've got an ISO setting here. You do absolutely have to set that. There's no automatic DX mode to detect your film speed, but of course I can change that ISO dial. I can overexpose or underexpose by using that if I want to. Right next to it though, I have an exposure compensation dial. It's nice and compact, so I don't feel like I'm gonna accidentally change it if I don't want to. I like that, and it lets me go +2 or -2 stops of exposure maximum. So this camera does not have manual exposure at all. Everything's basically gonna be either auto or program, but you do get some interesting controls. So starting here on the dial, we've got the white section. This gives you more of your manual controls. I've got a full bulb setting with a Pentax K release. I can go as long as I want to as far as the bulb exposure goes. Then there's a bokeh setting, but what this very simplistically does is force the aperture to 3.5, your maximum aperture all the time, to give you the shallowest depth of field. It's also a handy way if you want to really force the camera to get as much light as possible from the aperture, maybe crank that shutter speed up faster. Then I've got a nighttime mode, and this will allow the camera to go down to its predetermined 4 seconds of timed exposure based off the camera meter. So that's probably what I'm going to use when I want to try some night shots or long exposure photography. And then I've got my white program mode. So here the camera's going to choose the appropriate shutter speed or aperture, but it will not fire the flash unless I specifically want to put it into one of the flash modes. And then we've got here the little blue auto mode. Now this works a little bit differently than the program modes. Yes, it still sets aperture and shutter speed for you, but it will also fire the flash if it feels it's appropriate, or turn it off if it feels there's enough natural light. The other thing it does is something different with the focusing zones. It'll disregard your 2 closest focusing zones, and it does something called pan focus. Basically what that means is I still choose my focusing zones, but in the full auto mode, the camera's gonna try to default to tighter apertures and get you more depth of field. So even if you're not in the right focusing zone, it should still give you a good safety blanket. Lastly, we have these gold modes here. So you've got a gold program mode. In gold program, it will do all the same stuff it does in the other program mode, but it will choose to use the flash or not. And then you can go even further. You can go to the night mode. That'll again unlock 4 seconds of long exposure, but that'll also force the flash to fire every single time. Okay, so let's talk about the viewfinder here. Very interesting. I mean, first off, it's beautiful. It's actually one of the more striking visual features of this camera. It says craftsmanship by Pentax on top there. Shows you your film plane there on the top as well. Really nicely finished. But of course, this is also very important for composing your images. Now, this is a separate optical viewfinder. There's no mechanical linkage to the lens itself. We're not, using an SLR mirror or anything like that. So it's a separate frame. You're not going to quite get the exact matchup to the lens when you're framing. Now, I will say the etchings here, of course, in a vertical orientation as you hold the camera normally, because half frame is vertically orientated, but I can easily turn it sideways for the occasional horizontal shot. I know Jordan would like me to shoot more of those more in this episode, but the frame lines are clear. We also have separate frame lines for when you get close. It adjusts for the parallax as we adjust our camera closer to the actual subject itself. It also gives you the smaller, tighter frame to mimic getting closer into our macro modes. Now right here on the side of the viewfinder, we've also got a couple nice LEDs, and these just work in your peripheral vision, and they give you some indicators to keep aware of what the camera is doing here. So first off, if I'm in macro zone by accident, maybe I was doing a close-up, now I want to go shoot on the street, it'll actually give me a blinking warning just to say, hey, you are in macro, make sure that you're okay with that. In low light situations, I'll get a faster blue blinking light just to let me know that I'm in low light. I got to maybe hold the camera steady or just be cautious of that, maybe turn on the flash. I've also got indicators, for example, if I haven't wound the frame on and I'm trying to take pictures, both lights will blink to say, hey dummy, advance that thumb winder, I know you haven't used one in 20 years. Okay, so when you're using the Pentax 17, one of the first things you have to get a good handle on is how to focus this camera, because it's a fully manually focusing experience, and the camera doesn't autofocus Kind of, sort of. Let me explain here. So first off, you've got 6 zones of focus that you have to choose here. One of the other nice things is when I'm looking through the viewfinder here, I can actually see on the top what focusing zone I'm in, and that's a really handy reminder. Your first 4 would be pretty basic zones of distance. I've got an infinity setting, I've got a 10-foot setting, a 5.5-foot setting, and then a 4-foot setting. Then I've got 2 close-up modes, which Pentax calls a food mode and then a macro mode. Now, once you've chosen one of those distances, and it's important that you do so, the camera is going to adjust the lens slightly to go along with the aperture that's choosing to give you enough depth of field to cover a little bit in front and behind that focusing distance zone that you're ranging. So you're basically dealing with zones of focus to shoot in. And I mean, most of the time I'm going to be using the infinity or the 10-foot setting, but I do have to be conscious that I set the right setting for the situation that I want to shoot. So when I go to actually half press the shutter, I can feel the lens actually adjusting. There's little motors pushing it forward and backwards. And then of course it takes the picture, and I'm just going by the leaf shutter lens to know when I've actually captured my shot. There's a little bit of a delay there from when I want to shoot to when it takes a photo, but it is predictable. So I'm looking at my frame indicator here and I'm at 36 shots. So normally that's where I would stop, but I'm only halfway done on this roll. It's half frame. And so some of the reasoning behind that, yeah, we're trading some image quality, but at the same time, this camera is really intended to be a more fun analog experience, a little bit more wild, a little bit more from the hip, not necessarily maximum image quality. At the same time, it does mean that I save money because I get twice as many shots on a roll of film, and processing film is expensive. Okay, so we've decided to head up to Fairy Falls. The guys are all complaining, oh, it's such a long drive and a long hike just to get 1 or 2 photos, but that's photography, right? So it'll give us a good opportunity to test long exposures and some close-up shots. All right, so I found these purple flowers, which I'm gonna proceed to shoot with black and white film because that's what I got in the camera right now. And for macro, our minimum distance is about 25 centimeters, 0.82 feet. I wouldn't call this a macro lens by any sense, okay? But you could do some fun close-ups. Now to get my distance, I can actually just use the wrist strap here. This is great. I can just stretch it out, be about 1 inch away from my subjects, and that should be about right. And then I'm just gonna go with my Parallax viewfinder instead and make sure I'm in macro mode. I am. And we'll hope for the best. So as you can probably hear, we're getting really close to the falls now, and I want to take some long exposures on this film camera. It's going to be an experiment, but let's talk about how this camera exposes in meters in the first place. Okay, so as I mentioned already, this is program mode only, and there are some workarounds. I can try to work around and manipulate the quirks of this camera, but I don't get any manual exposure, and that is going to be a challenge. So I'm going to try a few things here. First off, the metering on this camera, it is a partial center weighted meter, okay? So a little bit of emphasis to the center, but largely it's just gonna average out the whole scene and give me a general exposure, try to get everything. But I do want to point out that the meter, the light meter, is actually inside the lens mount, and it's 40.5 millimeter filters. So I'm gonna put neutral densities on, and it should compensate for that. First thing I'm gonna try is the nighttime mode, because that does again let me go about 4-second long exposures, and that is gonna go by in the meter, but again, it's gonna already make the aperture f3.5. It's hard to get around that. The other thing I'm gonna try is bulb mode, but again, I'm stuck at f3.5. So for these long exposures, I'm not gonna get a lot of control over my depth of field, but we'll give it a shot here. So for the bulb mode, I'm just gonna again put the neutral density filter on. I'm gonna meter out with like a light meter calculator on my phone, just kind of work out what my exposure should be. And I'm just gonna give it a shot with the cable release, absolutely necessary here. But it's time to head up to the falls, just a few more switchbacks. Let's get to it and see what we get. All right, so I've had a really good time out here with the Pentax 17, but our time here is limited with the camera, and of course, it's film, so I don't know what I've got yet. So, of course, we're gonna have to send that film away to get developed, get some scans, see what we got. When I see you guys next time, we'll be back in Calgary. We'll talk about just our overall feelings on the camera and the results we got as far as the images go. We'll see you back home. So while we're waiting for that film to develop, you know what else has been developing? The Petapixel merch store. It is live and it is shipping internationally, and you can get our awesome Petapixel merch. Apparently, our Asian viewers love to call me Brother Beard. So look, you can get a Brother Beard shirt of your own and wear my facial hair around wherever you go. But there's so much more. You can get the classic Petapixel logo on your chest, or you can have a Loca shirt so that I never had to explain longitudinal chromatic aberration on camera ever again. Have you ever seen Jordan jump? Me neither, but you can see 8-bit Jordan jump. You're gonna see Jordan and I wearing these shirts on our channel, and we would love to know that you guys are out there wearing them as well. It shows us a lot of support for not only Jordan and myself, but also Petapixel and the channel in general. So if you wanna get yours, go to store.petapixel.com and order yours today. Okay, so we're back and we've got our film developed, we got everything scanned, it's sent over, I've had a look at the shots, and actually I was really impressed first off with how many keepers we got. So I only had time to shoot 2 rolls of film, one that was going to give me 72 shots, the other that gave me 48 shots, and actually between those 2 rolls I had a ton of keepers, so over 30 images that I liked, but actually what impressed me was how few were actually wrecked or unusable. And I have to say that one of the things I was really skeptical about and actually happily impressed by was the actual focusing system, because anytime you see zone focusing where you have to choose different distances, you see this a lot on like Fuji Instax cameras, it's usually going to be a disaster and very difficult to actually get precise focus. But on the Pentax 17, I actually was impressed by how well it worked. Also, the lens, when it is focused properly, is actually quite sharp. Now, a big part of your success with focusing is going to be what ISO of film that you choose to use. I mean, on a bright sunny day, I was using Kodak Portra 400. That higher speed worked fine, but I know the camera's using very tight apertures. Thus, I was getting lots of depth of field, and so focusing was very easy to do. I mean, the depth of field was expansive enough that it covered most situations. But then I also did shoot some Ilford FP4 125 ISO, and that was in more shaded conditions and stuff where I had very limited depth of field, and yet the focusing with the zones worked very well. So overall, I found that process to be not only fun, but way less stressful than I thought it was going to be. So another thing that worked out really well was the frame line. So there were some situations where they're a little hard to see depending on the lighting, but they were very accurate for the compositions. I mean, I shot this Portland, Oregon sign, and I want to have the triangle basically going to the bottom corners and the top of the frame, and the frame lines worked great. And then even up close with the Parallax corrected frame lines, that actually helped me frame really nicely. So I was very impressed with that part of it as well. So where you might find things a little bit tricky is when it comes to overall exposure on this camera. So the camera does a pretty good job of exposing general purpose scenes where you got a nice even match of tones. As I mentioned already though, this is a partially weighted averaging meter, and that means if your scene's predominantly dark tones or predominantly bright tones, the camera meter is going to overcompensate in the opposite direction, and that can lead to some poor exposures. If you grew up using a 70s film camera, you're going to be fine, but for a lot of people coming from a smartphone, this is going to be a bit of a learning curve. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but what I was finding with the exposures, there are some situations where my shadow is a little bit darker than I want, or highlights blew out a little bit more, and so I could certainly get the negs and rescan them. I mean, I'm just going with the scans that I was provided from the darkroom, but you know, if I wanted to rescan these myself, I could tweak contrast a little bit, I could tweak exposure a little bit, and certainly pull more out of it. At the same time though, if you get a little bit of practice under your belt, you'll start to learn when to just use exposure compensation, and the exposure compensation dial worked great. It was very effective. But as I was going over the photos that I got here on our journey to Portland, I actually really enjoyed the results that I got. And our editor-in-chief even said, like, these photos have a great vibe to them all the way through. I'm really liking it. And I actually got a lot more photos than I thought I would on this camera. I mean, when you're shooting an analog camera, part of the experience is not really knowing what you're going to get. And there's that surprise and that fun factor of seeing what actually came out of it. And I like the results I got here. You know, half frame image quality, yeah, the photos are going to be grainy. You're not going to get maximum sharpness. But honestly, I enjoyed it more than maybe like a Fuji Instax camera as far as image quality goes. I think I'm getting results that are really fun, that'll look great on social media, that I could even print out. Obviously, a smartphone's going to blow these away as far as image quality goes. A mirrorless camera's going to blow these. That's not the point. I mean, really here, I was having a lot of fun, and I liked the vibe that I was getting in the shots, and actually the results were quite decent, better than I expected. In some ways, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be very much a toy camera. I mean, the lens construction is kind of plasticky, and the way it feels, it doesn't focus super nice throughout the zones, but it works. Sometimes the dials, you know, they click, but they don't feel like they're super precisely made. At the same time, though, it looks from a distance like a very prestigious camera, and it has an absolute charm to it. But that being said, I found that the image quality was definitely well above what I expected out of a toy camera. And let's keep in mind, this camera is not priced like a toy camera. It is going to be a fairly significant investment for somebody that's wanting to get into analog photography. But I feel like although some parts of it felt like a toy, especially things like the limited shutter speeds, not having really any manual control to speak of in a big way, the results still showed that you could have a lot of fun and get some quite decent results, well above what you get out of something like a Holga or anything like that. And so I feel like the Pentax 17 is actually a really interesting first foray into analog photography for people that might be coming from a smartphone. And that's exactly what Pentax was trying to aim at. I think they've done a good job there. You get just enough control, especially things like the thumb winder and the experience of loading film yourself manually. You get those analog experiences. And at the same time, if you're a more experienced photographer who's used analog for a long time, you know exactly what you're doing, you might still have a lot of fun, because I know that I actually really did have a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it helps you decide if this camera is right for you. Pentax is absolutely making a big gamble with this camera, but I think it might just pay off. Time will tell. Leave your comments below. Let us know what you think. Also, do check out the podcast. It's on this exact same channel. You can watch it or listen to the Petapixel podcast on all your favorite podcasting apps. We'd love to see you there. Thanks for joining us, guys. We'll see you soon with more on Petapixel.